You're listening to Orange Blaze, a Florida Trail podcast.
People are like, oh, winter's the best time to hike in Florida. And I'm like, yeah, it's nice. It's cool. But I mean, I love spring and summer, fall. Give me the other seasons. I know it starts to get toasty. But I mean, it's beautiful. I mean, there's just so much to see. And it's funny now that I've like really dived into, native plants and landscapes and learning more about plants and like learning the bloom times and habitats and kind of like, okay, I really want to see pine lily. So I look for this and this, like there's certain things that you kind of like in your brain, check off to say, okay, I need to visit this park at this time, this park at that time, and kind of like plan out.
That was Stephanie Dunn, landscape architect and native plant enthusiast, and I'm Misty Ridley Little, Florida Trail hiker and host of the podcast. Like so many people, I find a lot of inspiration in the feed of various folks on Instagram, and Steph's feed was no different. Located in South Florida, Steph can be found traipsing the coastal scrub habitats of Jonathan Dickinson State Park or other coastal scrub preserves throughout Broward and Palm Beach counties, or trekking to the interior region of the state to Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park to photograph the wet and dry prairies, or to Big Cypress National Preserve to showcase the cypress swamps. It didn't matter to me where Steph was going. I was soaking in all of her photos in her feed. Raised on the East Coast of Central Florida, Steph found herself in South Florida during college and later working there as a landscape architect, and it was here she became drawn to the ecosystems and landscapes of South Florida. Since I spent so much time in the region of the state, I too am drawn to the places she shares, and it was because of how incredibly diverse and fascinating this region is that I wanted to have Steph on to impart some of her knowledge to hikers. I will admit, it made me quite homesick a few times listening to Steph talk about places I was already familiar with. A few notes. At one point, we were talking about tropical hardwood hammocks, and my brain says Everglades City as a place we didn't explore a lot. I explored plenty in Everglades City and the surrounding areas. I meant to say Flamingo in Everglades National Park, an area that we didn't visit very often. And the last note. I talk about being hesitant in wearing masks while hiking or at state parks. We recorded this episode in late April when masks were just beginning to be in use and things were still quite up in the air. I think it's been quite covered by now that not wearing a mask while hiking, as long as you're maintaining a good distance from others, not in your social group, is okay, but you should be carrying a mask to be courteous for situations where distancing cannot be maintained. As well, many states or localities have put in mask mandates in place, so do know what those are for where you're hiking. Masks make us all safer and get us to a place where we can be hiking mask-free and doing long trails with ease once again. All right, enough COVID, and on to the episode. So hey, nice to meet you. I've been, kind of fangirling you for many years now, so it's good to talk to you.
It's very nice to finally be able to put a face to the name and get to speak with you. So I appreciate time tonight to talk. So
yes. So I guess maybe if you want to just introduce yourself and who you are a little bit, so that way, this is a little bit of a different podcast. It's not strictly Florida Trail. We're going to be talking about a lot of different things, but yeah, a little bit who you are and your background. I think you might be native Floridian.
Yes. So my name is Stephanie Dunn. Most people know me as Steph Lee on Instagram. I was born and raised in Palm Bay, Florida, so in southern Brevard. So I heard you actually lived in Melbourne for some time.
Yes.
My woods. So I'm just a second generation Floridian and grew up there, and I love being from there. It's just a beautiful place, and I think it's just a beautiful spot in Florida. And I think where it was geographically located, the kind of natural areas that were around, like, was just kind of like perfect for me and like my experience. And it's awesome. And now I'm living in South Florida, so I'm residing in Palm Beach County, and I work in Broward. So kind of like southern central Florida all the way to South Florida, kind of like my range now. And I'm kind of like a Florida Panther. I have like a big territory that I kind of and just getting outdoors. So I mean, just getting into like plants and nature. I mean, like I said, being from southern Brevard, I think what's really unique about that area is being a coastal county, its proximity to the Indian River Lagoon, proximity to the St. Johns River to the west is just kind of like the perfect balance of living in a city and kind of sprawling suburb, I guess, not really a dense city, and having those like natural areas around, which is great.
Yeah. Yeah. So we moved to Melbourne right after Chris had gotten into Florida Tech for grad school. And that's kind of where we started geocaching, which led us to all the different natural areas. And I spent many hours running at Turkey Creek Sanctuary and, going to see the manatees and, driving to Sebastian Buffer Preserve and all these different, cool, like public lands that, people weren't hiking on. And I really miss that area because I'm sure it's a little bit different now. I haven't been in so many years, but it didn't take long to feel kind of rural and just very into nature.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you mentioned Turkey Creek Sanctuary because as a kid, my mom used to take me to the public library there. We'd walk over to the nature center. Like I have very fond memories of doing that and going on the boardwalk there. And now it's a place I love to return to. And I recently went with my mom earlier this year, and it's just nice to be able to think back and reflect on those memories as a child and then getting to do it now, being older, almost 30. So.
Yeah. Now, where did you end up in college?
So I ended up at Florida Atlantic University. I decided to stay in state, got scholarship, so it was more affordable for my family. And then I chose coming to FAU because it's only 2 hours from home. I was close enough to mom and dad, like to go home and do laundry and visit. Far enough away to kind of have that like going away college experience. And obviously being in South Florida and the industry and the urban area that's here, like studying architecture, kind of, being in this environment was conducive to learning that and studying that, which was great.
So did you always have like interest in nature and like, or how did you switch from, or want to go from, enjoying nature and then focusing on architecture and specifically like landscape architecture? What made you decide that?
Like growing up, being where I was from, like I grew up sailing on the Indian River Lagoon with my parents, like being around all that nature. And then like when I was young and in grade school, then when I got to high school, it was more sports driven. Then it was, okay, I'm going to go now to college and study. So I kind of like had this disconnect with nature while I was having these human experiences in college and doing the whole university bit. And then reconnecting with that my later years of college and kind of like having a more solid relationship with my parents and spending time with them. Like I never did the whole spring break experience of going and partying somewhere. I would do road trip with mom and dad to go camping in a travel trailer or going down to the Florida Keys, but going to like a resort or snorkeling out and going to state parks. So that was something that I liked doing, but kind of like looping back into that when I was in architecture school, I enjoyed most was site design, like how buildings are situated on a site, how they're oriented based off, solar, wind, and kind of like the natural systems and how the building integrates with that between man-made and natural. So that aspect is what I like the most about architecture, which actually ties more into landscape architecture. So I kind of like made that transition in my last year of schooling when I met my now bosses, Rebecca and Gage. They own Cadence, which is a landscape architecture firm in Fort Lauderdale. They hired me as an intern and then started working full time after school. Okay. And I graduated in 2014. So over 5 years now, I've been working for them. So.
Okay. Yeah. So you spent a lot of time, it sounds like you spent quite a bit of time, traveling and going to state parks and that. But when you came to South Florida, was it kind of a big learning curve of trying to learn the different landscapes down there? I mean, obviously it's probably way more urban than you're used to. So
yeah, I mean, in college, I really didn't explore much of the natural world in South Florida. But once I was able to graduate and I was like really living here and devoted, like this is where I'm going to stay, this is where I'm working. Then I really started to explore and kind of like tying back into my job is like, well, I'm working with plants, I'm working with this landscape, this physical thing. in urbanized areas, how can I infuse that with like the natural Florida that I always loved? Well, the only way to do that is to learn more about natural Florida and get out there and get experience. And then that's really when I really started to kind of explore. And it really didn't like click in my head and connecting that until I was already working at Cadence for a number of years. It wasn't until the beginning of 2017 when I did a first day hike that the Florida State Parks do. Mm-hmm. And I went to Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park. It's the first time I ever went to that park. I was on a hike that was led by the president of the Friends group that's there. And she was also involved with Florida Native Plant Society for one of the Pinellas County chapter. She's like, I was looking at plants, I was photographing, I was really enjoying the walk and just taking and absorbing the information. She's like, you need to go and join Florida Native Plant Society. So then that kind of like, okay, really focused on plants. Like, it's not just to do your job, but like, what can you do to make it more interesting, and just gaining that knowledge and how I can apply it to my work is kind of what just sparked it even more. So really, I've only been like heavily exploring native Florida and like wild places and like really going to state parks in the last,
3-4 years.
Yeah. So okay. It's kind of a short time frame where I'm just like feeling like a human sponge and I'm just trying to absorb everything as possible.
Well, and I kick myself because I was living and working in South Florida, and I feel like, I got to know the landscape, but it's even now later, 10 years after I've left the state, that I'm even learning even more. And it's just it's a constant growth really of just learning and absorbing more information and realizing just how much you don't know. And so.
I feel like it is a little bit overwhelming in like the world that we're living in. There's all this access to information, but it's like your brain can only take so much at a time. But it's also like trying to take in the right information, trying to sift through the noise of like what's important, and like trying to connect the dots and like how, you fit into like this bigger landscape or picture, and how you can enjoy it or make it positive or preserve it and save it for the future, and, your impact and footprint that you're leaving. So it's kind of that constant balancing act, which I find really interesting. In South Florida, it's kind of like its own state.
Yeah.
I feel like a majority of the population is very disconnected to a degree. There's a lot of people that obviously care about the beauty of life. They like going to the beach. They like, going for bike rides, enjoying the neighborhood parks and things like that. But like really getting out to the wild parts, I don't feel like it's common for everyone to do that. And I feel like more people do that, they do feel more connected. So hopefully that change will shift. And I think like environmentally, people are more conscientious now, and maybe that'll be different, a few years from now.
So, I think your outline you sent me, and then what I added to it is like pretty broad and in depth. But I think one of the first things you talked about was the landscapes of South Florida, which is, you're heavily focused on South Florida, and I'm going to have Lily said she was going to come on and talk about North Florida and that region. So I'm excited to have some different people talking about the landscapes. But
yes.
The reason why I want to do this podcast was because, people come to South Florida or Florida in general, they have a basic understanding of, okay, well, I'm going to start in Big Cypress. It's going to be a swamp. It's going to be wet. And, there's some wet spots in other areas. And what else is there? I think people have a good understanding, but they may not necessarily like put it all together on a bigger scale of how just important some of these landscapes are and how interconnected they are. And just especially once you start looking at, Everglades restoration for one, people walking through the levees south of Okeechobee, how that affects where they just came from in Big Cypress. So I feel like this is a very broad topic, but maybe if you do want to talk about some of the landscapes of South Florida, the different ecosystems and how they interact a little bit. And
Sure. Well, I guess to first start off is like you mentioned, the Florida Trail goes through Big Cypress. It goes towards Lake Okeechobee and then into the Kissimmee River ecosystem. So that's South Florida, parameter where the trail is actually physically going through. So obviously in Big Cypress, you're going to experience marshes, which are, non-tidal systems that are not forested. They're dominated by grasses, sedges, and other herbaceous plants. In South Florida, you'll think of sawgrass marshes or prairies or sloughs, which, provide habitat for waterfowl and other wildlife. And when I think of those types of landscapes, I think of like great white egrets or snowy egrets that are just sitting out on the landscape and kind of pop out of the grasses. So, you're experiencing that. You think of, like you mentioned, like cypress swamps and like going through freshwater swamp systems, that are forested. So it's a different experience than like being out in an open marsh, where it's no sun protection.
Yeah.
Space, right? And everyone, thinks of the river grass, that expanse. So, and then the freshwater swamps are just amazing. I've done a few swamp walks out in Big Cypress, different times of year. I've gone when it's been really wet. I've gone when it's been really dry. And that's just like amazing to witness. And I feel like everybody should do that at one point. And I wish more people could experience that, because that's kind of just like ephemeral, and just like to be in that moment and like experiencing that. And those are all like freshwater ecosystems, those marshes and swamps. So all of that is driven by hydrology. So when you talk about times of years when people can actually walk through the swamp,
yeah.
hydrology is extremely important to the types of plants you're going to see, how much wildlife is there, seasons where the water is much lower, there's not as much birds nesting, their counts are lower. So that's all affected by that hydrology that happens. And all of that is water from the Kissimmee River Valley going to Lake Okeechobee. And then when it does,
yeah.
well, that's a whole nother issue. And then rainfall into, and then, the low amount of flow into the Everglades. But that elevation change between Flamingo and this most southern part of Everglades National Park on the mainland of Florida all the way to Lake Okeechobee. There's not a lot of elevation change, but those minimal bits is what gets you that mosaic landscape that you see, which I find personally really interesting. I get most excited when I go out on a trail. There is slight elevation change because you see a multitude of plant diversity, which is wonderful. Beyond that, of like what you see from the Florida Trail in terms of that, like those are the two main ecosystems I feel like everyone thinks about. But, you have the pinelands that you start to get into when you're on the Ocean to Lake Trail, that spur trail that connects off. So that I feel like is really fun to hike that through in parts of Jonathan Dickinson and Riverbend Park and some of the natural areas in Palm Beach County where that trail goes through. Those are some of the funnest segments of the Florida Trail that I have been able to hike on for day hiking. That's really amazing. When you have pineland forests, you're characterized by this open canopy of pine trees, which creates this very diverse assemblage of plants in the understory. And that's where you get a lot of wildflowers, and that's where you see that occurring, which is great. And then I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but part of the Florida Trail, there's like loops within Jonathan Dickinson that go through scrub habitat.
Yes.
Which I've done a few out and backs from the ranger station close to the park entrance, which is great. And scrub habitat in Florida, you have the historical scrub where a lot of endemics and rare flora happening on the Lake Wales Ridge. But here in South Florida, it's all happening along the coast near the Atlantic Coast Ridge. So that higher elevation, that's a couple miles wide, where basically 95 is. Yeah. Developed. But when you get into Jonathan Dickinson, it's more towards the coast, towards US 1. But amazing scrub flora. I love scrub plants. They're some of my favorite to see. So that's a fun segment. So getting diversity. It's not all swamps. There's also scrub and pineland to explore too.
Yeah, coming back here to Texas and talking to people, I primarily am an environmental consultant, and you do a lot of wetland delineations and things like that. And, they would ask like, well, how would you delineate this in Florida? I'm like, well, in Florida, an inch or two could be high and upland, and your wetland, it was pretty clear, like where your line is a lot of times. Like there's an upland because, okay, these plants are definitely not going to be, 3 inches lower in the water here. So,
well, yeah. And like the tree islands, that's another thing.
Yeah.
Like the hammocks in the Everglades, that little bit of higher elevation, you get these broadleaf trees that can be 40 to 50 feet in the air. You have this dense canopy that creates the shade, and having all types of mosses and ferns, epiphytes and bromeliads, like really thriving in those types of environments. So, I mean, it's just, there's great diversity. And I think there are some key places that you can hike to see a lot of that in a day hike situation. And that's, to me, the most exciting thing about getting out into nature is seeing so much that it's just like, this is amazing. Like I feel that just is like oohing and ahhing the whole time I'm on a trip.
I feel like there's one habitat that I wish that the Florida Trail really saw more of, and I think you get a taste of it on if you hike the Florida Keys on the Eastern Continental Trail part. I think you get a little bit of the tropical hardwood hammock taste, but you don't really get that on the Florida Trail. And I wish for some reason that we could somehow, start in Everglades City or somewhere like that and get that. But that is and that's one habitat I'm not as familiar with, because to be honest, we just didn't go that direction nearly as much. We were always in Big Cypress and Fakahatchee and places like that. So.
No, Everglades National Park, it would be awesome if there was a way that the trail could somehow get into there, because there's just so much. I mean, there's amazing landscapes, and I mean, obviously the Everglades is like, when you just say the words, it just like gives me goosebumps, because I just know like there's just amazing things out there to like witness, to like bear witness to nature and just see it like happen.
Yeah. So, do you have any particular like habitats in South Florida that are your favorite?
Yes.
Besides scrub?
Well, to roll into Everglades National Park specifically, I love going to Long Pine Key near the campground. There's the Long Pine Key Nature Trail, which is there's like 22 miles of trails that kind of interconnect. People do walk it. A lot of people bike it. But there's a small little trail. It's called 3-in-1. It's super short. I've taken my parents on it, which is great. So if you have people with you that are not experienced hikers, it actually goes through pine rockland habitat, and it goes out to the prairie. There's like prairie marsh, like sawgrass marsh. And then it cuts, and then you basically like triangle back into tropical hammock, hardwood hammock. So you get like a little taste of 3 different habitats in one. And then the best thing is like, I always tell people the ecotones where the habitats meet. So where the pine rocklands meeting the prairie, or where the pine rocklands meeting the hammock, like that's where the zones where there's the most diversity of plants or wildlife. So those are kind of like the things I look for when I'm wanting to explore a trail. But besides Everglades, like thinking more of like South Florida towards Southwest Florida, I mean, Fakahatchee Strand Preserve, I've only ever been to once. Love to go back. When I went, it was bone dry in May. It was, I think, 2 years ago. And we were there with the park biologist, Mike Owen, and he was telling us all about the orchids and everything. Glowing to be able to just like walk through that. And I have never been in wet season, so I've seen Carlton Ward Jr.'s photos of it in his videos, and I can't even imagine. I mean, it's like the crazy change of hydrology.
It's really pleasant, actually. And in the summer, it's like its own air conditioner, basically. So you're wet, but it feels good. You're not sweating. I mean, you sweat, but you're not. Yeah. It's really cool.
So that's the one thing I would love to do is go, and I love going back to places and experiencing them different times of the year. So that is one where I've only ever been once, and I'd love to go back again. And then obviously Jonathan Dickinson State Park is a beautiful state park. If anyone hasn't been, I definitely recommend it. There is something for everybody. And just the diversity of habitat there. Like when I go, I plan my visits where try to get there super early, and I hike out on the scrub trails because I know it's going to be cooler in the morning, and then I shift to the more pineland habitat in the afternoon, midday, where I get a little bit of shade and canopy cover. Planning to paddle too on the Loxahatchee River is awesome. So that's a great state park to visit too. So
yeah,
my top top of where I'd like to get to know better and keep going back to.
So we've been talking about landscapes, and I think in Florida, when you're hiking on the Florida Trail, it's really about a lot of the flora and fauna. And yes, it's not necessarily, you're not necessarily going to have this, gorgeous mountain views and things like that, but it's a lot of times the more subtle things that you're going to be finding along the trail. Can you talk a little bit about the deeper aspects of these landscapes? Like, you've briefly touched on some of the plants and the habitats, but maybe how these communities evolved and any particular species to be looking out for.
Absolutely. So part of the reason why South Florida is so much a biodiversity hotspot is because over time, natural phenomena, evolution, there is the flora that's here has been influenced by a multitude of things. It's been influenced by the Caribbean and having tropical plants, and there's species that are native here that can be found throughout the tropics and the Caribbean. You also have species that are found in the southeastern coastal plain, from more temperate plants that are also native to the state. And then also obviously endemic influence, like I mentioned about the Lake Wales Ridge, the natural water level of the state being under and above water, and that evolution itself. So all those influences have created this spot where there's a crazy amount of biodiversity. So you're going to see plants here in South Florida that you can't see anywhere else in the continental United States. And 60% of the native species here, like in South Florida below Lake Okeechobee, originated in the tropics that had, that you can find elsewhere. So it's really a different landscape. So that's, I feel like, why people vacation here, because I feel like it's not like any part of the other, the US, like they're, in the tropics. So that is definitely, why the plant diversity is the way it is, on top of the hydrology, the climate, and the geology, and just the way our shape of the state is, and all that kind of stuff is all coming together to be what South Florida is, and how unique it I don't think people realize how unique it is that you're getting to be able to experience this landscape. Natural things had to happen over such a long period of time for you to be able to experience that.
Yeah. So when you're out hiking, what are some, I guess maybe even, I don't know how much you're getting out right this moment, but typically this time of year, what would people be seeing on the trail, or what's blooming right now that you've seen recently?
So in springtime, this would be the time when I would be at Jonathan Dickinson State Park or out at Long Pine Key. I would be looking for terrestrial ground orchids like grass pinks, which are calopogon species, or spiranthes species. One of the coolest things I've seen out at Everglades National Park was man in the ground. It's a type of morning glory that has this bright pinkish red bloom. It's stunning to see. I've only ever seen it once, but I saw it in spring one year. This is the best time to be out hiking in Florida to see all the wildflowers, and so I'm really kind of distraught that I can't do that now. But there's amazing things to see. I was at Everglades earlier this year, and there was southeastern sneezeweed in large stands, which is a bright yellow wildflower. It's so cheery too. I see it up at Kissimmee Prairie. I can't remember its natural range and say. I think it might be throughout the state, and that's a beautiful wildflower to see. And let's see what other things right now. I know the sundews are blooming, the carnivorous plants, so that's another thing that it's always fun to see when you're kind of in a boggy, kind of wet area to look out for.
Yeah. And I think that's pretty common to see along pretty much most of the Florida Trail. And I don't know if people even know what they are necessarily either. They probably just walk by them and like there's
Yeah.
this little like red plant at the bottom that's I'm stepping on. But if
Yeah.
you look closely, it's a carnivorous plant.
Yeah, those are pretty neat. I mean, other common plants that they like hikers would see obviously are like different types of epiphytes, like Tillandsia species. There's 16 different native species of Tillandsia in Florida. Many of them are found in South Florida in their range, getting really unique ones, especially towards Fakachi Strand and parts of Big Cypress. So that's always neat to see. Utricularia, which is bladderwort species. Those are another carnivorous plant that's always fun to see. Out of Big Cypress, I've seen purple and yellow blooming, and those are great. I've seen those. They bloom around the spring too when I see Spiranthes in bloom. There's a Spiranthes odorata. That species smells so good. It's heaven when you smell it. I felt that out of Big Cypress. There's like, we hadn't seen like hardly any wildflowers because the trail was so flooded when we went. It was like late spring, early summer. And then there's just one bloom by itself and it was great. So, I mean, they're definitely like, I personally too, I love seeing sawgrass in bloom.
Oh yes, I do too. I love sawgrass.
Like the full regalia of sawgrass is really pretty. I love it in big stands too. Like I've seen it up close at Along Pine Key on the nature trail. There's like I remember there's like a 50-yard segment of the trail where there's like a lot of it just kind of like massed and you're just right along the trail and it's just all blooming and it's really fun to see because it gets so tall and you kind of feel a little bit dwarfed by it.
Mm-hmm. Did you happen to ever see the giant cowhorn orchid out in Everglades before it died?
Never did. I've seen it so many times in photos. I feel like I've seen it in person, but I can't imagine that experience, being able to see that. But I wish I did. Yeah,
we were lucky enough. I think we went and saw it twice. And I wish I had, Chris, I think, might have taken some better photos, but I don't have anything too great. I think my camera had died around that time. But I was really disappointed to see that that died. So.
I mean, storms are a natural part of, the evolution of plants and animals, in the landscape. And, sometimes it's a bad thing. But, certain things get damaged, like that, something that's beloved and recognizable and everyone like pilgrimages to see it. Right.
Yeah.
But you also have instances where, maybe a parcel of land that hasn't been managed properly, that's too dense in pines. Now the pines have, fallen and now the landscape can be reinvigorated, with that open sunshine coming through the canopy. So there's goods and bad about storms.
Yes, of course. No, but that was particularly painful though. This really old orchid that was massive.
I saw photos on the Facebook group that I'm a part of that I kind of just, I never post anything really. I just kind of earn and kind of take it in it. But Florida Flora and Ecosystematics. It's like core flora people that like key out stuff and talk about genetics. Like they really get into it and I just listened. But they had some amazing photos of that orchid and everyone was sharing I remember when that happened.
Yeah,
it was just like it was so pretty, that orchid.
So we've talked about just kind of a general plants and stuff, but do you have anything that's your favorite in particular in South Florida?
That's like asking me, what my favorite kind of chocolate is.
Well, you can't actually, I was gonna say, you can't like mention South Florida without the pine lily too.
Yes, I was just gonna say, recently, well, not recently, but last fall, I went out to Cypress Creek North Natural Area, which is managed by Palm Beach County Environmental Resource Management. And I follow them. They're a great follow on Instagram and Facebook. And they share posts when they do prescribed burns. And they had a map and said, okay, we're going to be burning this. And I kind of put that in the back of my head and decided, I'm going to go back in a couple months and see what comes up. And of course, because they managed the land so well, there was pine lilies galore. It's the first time ever seeing pine lilies for me outside of Kissimmee Prairie Preserve. That's the only place where I had ever seen pine lilies.
Okay.
Active, So that was exciting. So yeah, pine lilies are beautiful. I also really like the pine pink, which is a terrestrial ground orchid that I've seen there at Cypress Creek North Natural Area too. And I've seen that it blooms at funky times. It kind of is like a winter, it says spring and summer online, but I've seen it blooming more winter time to early blooming. And that's a beautiful orchid to see, which, it's so fun when you get to see that kind of stuff. And when you see like plants like that you really don't see often, it's just really exciting. And ground orchids win. Calipogon and Spiranthes, I get so excited when I see them. And butterworts too. Butterworts are always fun. Another carnivorous plant. I see those at Jonathan Dickinson a lot. And then there's just, it's hard because like there is so much beautiful flora. I see tons of plants every time I go out and hiking, and I kind of feel bad sometimes because I'm like, oh, this is so pretty, but I'm like, but that's also so pretty. I have to pick your favorite. The orchids are wonderful, especially being down here in South Florida. I feel like I don't know if it's just because like I know where to go to see things, but I feel very lucky because it's like common for me at least, sometimes because I know there's a spot in Jonathan Dickinson, like I know where the butterwort patch is, I know where the grass pink patch is, so I kind of know where to look for stuff, and a lot of people don't, and a lot of the information is not really like known, and obviously to like protect the plants not getting poached or like people stomping around on them to take photos. So there's kind of like you want to share that information so that people can get excited about these places, but also to protect the natural area too of kind of withholding some stuff. So that's me that I feel like all the time on social media, experiences.
Well, and like you mentioned, it's just really a knowledge of studying. You can flip through your guidebooks forever and ever and finally like learning about, we talked about geology too, like soil types and hydrology and blooming season. So if you're looking in winter for something that blooms in July, then you're not going to find it, or you're hiking in the wrong place. And it's definitely, trial and error too. Like, oh, okay. I know where to look here. And once you get to learn and intimately know a place, this goes for anywhere. It doesn't have to be Florida, but it could be anywhere. That's where you find the cool things.
And that's when nature reveals its secrets. The more you go back, the more it tells you things and shows you things that you normally wouldn't be able to see. People are like, oh, winter's the best time to hike in Florida. And I'm like, yeah, it's nice. It's cool. But I love spring and summer, fall. Give me the other seasons. I know it starts to get toasty. But it's beautiful. There's just so much to see. And it's funny now that I've like really dived into, native plants and landscapes and learning more about plants and like learning the bloom times and habitats and kind of like, okay, I really want to see pine lily. So I look for this and this, like there's certain things that you kind of like in your brain, check off to say, okay, I need to visit this park at this time, this park at that time, and kind of like plan out. And it's been a struggle like the past 2 years when I'm really like, I'm like torn about where I want to go. And I've really put some miles on
the only place I've seen pine lilies in Apalachicola, I believe, and Jonathan Dickinson. Those are the only two places I've seen them.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, I haven't seen them at Jonathan Dickinson. I need to look. I've never been. See, and I usually do Jonathan Dickinson in spring and summer. I don't think I've done a real fall visit yet there.
Yeah, I think we had to make ourselves go. We went in like mid-August or late August when it was the start of them. And we're like, okay, we need to go. Because we were primarily, and this is something I realized as we came back to Texas, it's like, it's hot in Texas, it's hot in Florida, but we don't hike nearly as much as we did in the summer as we did in Florida. Yeah. And I think it's because we always went to the swamp to hike. And like I said, there was water and it was cooler. And now there's no water to swamp in here. And I'm like, we just don't hike so much. So, but yeah, I think that was one of the reasons we had to make ourselves go to Jonathan Dickinson in August because it's hot and there's no swamp. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think just kind of transition just a little bit. We've talked a little bit about some of your experiences on the Florida Trail, but yeah, talk a little bit about that. Like, when did you find out about the Florida Trail? Did you know about it growing up, or was it something you just kind of came into as you, got older and were started exploring?
Yeah, I don't ever recall knowing about the Florida Trail when I was a kid. I don't remember my parents ever talking about it, but I have fond memories camping out at Ocala National Forest with my parents. So I should ask them if they knew what it was, but my parents weren't crazy outdoor enthusiasts. They enjoyed it. They were more beach bunnies and sailboating and that kind of stuff. But yeah, it wasn't really until I was an adult. I joined Instagram real late in the game. I joined like when I was a junior in college. And then I started following a bunch of people, obviously in the Instagram community, like Madeline Panera and following Keith Karapucci and Elaney. So starting to follow them on social media. And then I was like, oh, there's this whole other level. And then starting to follow you. And so I just like over time, I've just learned. But I had Sandra Friend's books. Obviously, I can't not talk about her when I started to get into hiking and like exploring. And then obviously she mentions the Florida Trail in her books. So that kind of like triggered like, oh, there's this whole thing. Because I've been to parts of the Appalachian Trail and done day hiking there. I've actually hiked the National Ice Age Scenic Trail in Wisconsin.
Oh, okay.
So you're talking about Florida being the red-headed state child. I don't know about. I feel like nobody knows about the Ice Age National Scenic Trail up there. But yeah, I have hiked a little bit there, but I've never gone out west. But yeah, Florida. Getting to know, like, it's only been recently that I've really learned about the Florida Trail, and I really don't even know that much to say that.
Yeah, right. So, do you have any favorite? What's the places that you've been to so far?
Yeah, so I've been in South Florida on the Florida Trail. I've been part of Big Cypress out from I-75 at the mile marker, where the big rest stop is. I've hiked north out of there, out and back, and to the south as well. And when I did that, I went with my coworker once, and then another time we were with the Florida Native Plant Society group. So that's more of a walk or a saunter in nature. Yeah. A little bit more slower going, we're botanizing, looking at lots of little plants, in a 1 meter plot. There's like all these plants, and we don't get very far from the parking lot, but we did hike out there when it was dry, and that was fun. To see. It was interesting trying to hike through the kind of dampish, dryish marl.
Oh yeah, it's slipping and sliding. Yeah.
That time of year was nice, and there was the people call it prairie milkweed or few flowered milkweed, Asclepias plata, and that was in bloom. So that's fun to see. It looks like a little flag, like flapping in the breeze, and bright red and orange blooms. I love Asclepias species, so I'm kind of I like those too. I didn't mention them earlier, but I do like them as well.
I will tag on to that one too.
Yes, suppose. Oh, they're so pretty. They're such complex flowers. They're so neat. Yeah, and then obviously, Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park. I love that place. Oh my gosh, it's so magical. So I haven't done huge segments there, but I've hiked out on Military Trail, and I've also hiked out on a 5 mile prairie trail out to Rollerson Trail. I went out a handful of miles and then came back. So I've done that, and then I've also done Split Oak Wildlife and Environmental Area. Oh yeah. Because that's pretty close to my parents. It's like less than an hour drive from Southern Park. So on because you count that's like the Florida Trail.
Yeah.
Right? And
yeah.
You have Ocean to Lake, obviously. That segment I've done parts in. A little bit in Jonathan Dickinson. There's like just about 1.5 miles in Riverbend Park.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Maintained by Palm Beach County Parks and Rec, and then Hungryland Slough Natural Area. There's like almost 4.5 miles there. So between those 3 parks on the Ocean to Lake, I've kind of explored a little bit.
Yeah, and we mentioned this earlier. Like the Ocean to Lake is like a really good like synopsis of the Florida Trail in a way, and you get such a diversity of habitats. Start at the lake, and then you just get these different in and out of swamps and marshes and some pine uplands a little bit in there, and then you really kind of come up into the pine palmetto complexes, and then your scrub, and then the beach. It's just like
like
know.
quick tour. You really do.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, and the Ocean Lake definitely has like a cult kind of following, like, you know, because it's a good local trail and you can do it, you know, in a long weekend if you're so inclined.
Yeah, I've never done never done me and my plants and taking photos. Yeah, I don't get very far. Really, I'm a really slow hiker. I can be fast if I want. I think the most I ever did in like a day was like almost 8 miles at Split Oak.
Okay.
And I got there at sunrise and I didn't leave until about 1 o'clock. So like the whole morning I was just out there, which was fun. It was great. But yeah, most I ever hiked in a day, and I was like, oh my goodness.
No, you and Kate, Little Nuthatch, remind me of each other so much, just because you guys like to go slow and you take these just beautiful little tiny photos of, like, you know, you find the spider hiding on the milkweed, or you find the cool web, and I appreciate that you take your time and look.
Yeah, Kate is great at eyeing that kind of stuff when we go hiking together, because I feel like I'm constantly learning from her that kind of stuff, because I'm looking more at like the greater landscape, and the nerd in me and like my landscape designer brain is like, oh, look at the textures. Like I tell Kate, like, look at the saw palmetto with this blue stem grass and like this other plant in front, like texturing, like the organization, like, do you see it? And then she's like, Stephanie, look at this cool bird over here. Ooh, look at this kind of spider. I had no idea what it was. And she's like her, like the world of like macro for her, like the way she sees things is really cool. So I like learn a lot from that, because I'm looking more of like the bigger landscape picture. So it's nice to, it's when we do spend time in nature together. Yeah. So it's been great to talk with her on Instagram. And then like, I remember we like reached out to each other and I was like, oh, I want to go to Econloxahatchee Sand Hills, which is near where she is. And so we were able to meet up for the first time. And then since then we've hiked together out at Kissimmee Prairie and camped and stuff. So that's great. So that's a good friendship through the love of outdoors and nature. So
yes. Sorry, I have questions and other things, and my mind's going a million different ways.
No problem.
Yeah, so are you primarily hiking by yourself, or do you go out? It sounds like you go out with other people sometimes.
Primarily on my own, because a lot of the people that I'm close with in South Florida will not get up at the crack of dawn with me. One of my best dear friends, Kelly, she moved away to Tallahassee, but she was the one friend I could rely on that would be like, yeah, I'll get up at 5 o'clock for you and we'll drive to catch sunrise. Like, she was my go-to. So since she's gone, I've just been more of a solo hiker. Every now and then my coworkers will join. I do the FNPS group hikes when we do like field trips and stuff. And then every now and then with my parents, but it's usually me. And I kind of like that solitary nature, because when I'm out there, you know, me being by myself and then getting to experience that. I don't feel like I have to entertain somebody else or like worry about them, which is, it's nice to have company at times, especially with like-minded people, but I do find solace in being on my but I did do a hike once. I led for the Girls Who Hike Florida group. Angie asked me to do a hike. I did it at Malabar Scrub Sanctuary, which is in southern Brevard, and it's beautiful. There's scrub jays, lots of diversity. It was habitat that was slated for development and then preserved. It's just fun. And it was myself, my best friend from my hometown. She came, brought her little baby with her. And then one of my friends from college like saw me post through Instagram, and she drove all the way up from South Florida.
Oh, wow.
To come up and go on the hike. And then there was another woman from Orlando that came. So it was like a super small group. And I was like, okay, I like drew out my map. I was like, okay, these are the spots I'm going to hit to show you diversity at the site. And like did it. And I was making sure we got our miles in, because the Girls Who Hike Florida love to get their miles. So we did like 6 miles that day, just for a couple of hours in the morning. So that was fun. I would like to do that again. A lot of people like through social media and Instagram are like, oh, you go to these places and, you know, can you tell me more about it? And so I think I should try to lead more hikes, or try to open it up to people who do follow me on Instagram if they would like to join. Because I think there are people that are interested but are just nervous to go out on their own or really don't know what to look for. And if they had somebody kind of show them, then they'd be more inclined to do that. So
Yeah. Sure. Now, since you're out alone by yourself so much, do you have any like, strange encounters or animal encounters, like anything weird? Like, have you seen anything crazy happen?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. I fortunately have never had a very, very weird encounter. Like, I've never had anything where I've been fearful of my life or nothing like that. A few kind of wild characters every now and then. There was this one guy out at Jonathan Dickinson. I wasn't far from the park road. And I was kind of like on this little sandy trail, kind of going through kind of scrubby flatwoods. And this guy's walking up. He has like this huge stick in his hand, like hook, like the kind that for herping, for snakes. He's walking. He's like, hey, and he like puts his stick down. He's like, hey, can you put my keys in my backpack for me? Like locking up his bike. And then like his truck that I could see on the park road was kind of beaten up, like it was a little smashed a bit. He was super friendly, super nice. He's like, oh, I'm out here doing photography too. And he had his camera, like he was like legitimately going out to like photograph stuff. And so he was super nice meet to find out. First I was like, this is a little funky, like, but he was super friendly and was fine. That's probably the only experience like that I can think of. But like when I hike, when I tromp, I always have my big stick. Sometimes when I go alone to places, I will bring that with me if I'm going to a particular place, if I've ever gotten goosies before, where you kind of freak yourself out. But I always have pepper spray on me, on my pack, if I'm wearing my backpack or on my vest. I often sometimes will like go light and just have my vest and my camera on me and then everything on my person. And I also have a knife that I carry on me too.
Okay. Yeah.
Gotta be smart and just in case.
Yeah, so. No, definitely for sure. I've mentioned before, I like going out by myself too. I don't get to do it that often anymore, but I've been known to like just scare myself more than anything. Nothing really crazy has ever happened. It's just more like, okay, yeah. And it's not necessarily people, it's more like wildlife. Like I'm more worried about that sometimes than anything else.
Yeah. Never had any scary wildlife encounters. I always I've always keep my distance from gators. I've never had any like scary snake encounters. I bet there's probably been some scary snakes around me, but I just didn't notice them and probably just moved along. But no, I haven't had any kind of like negative experiences like that. I mean, there's a few times because I do love a good sunrise. Like I love going early and hiking early before it gets too hot. And there are some times where I'll get to a place and it's dark and I'm like tempted to go out and take photos, but I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to sit in my car until daybreak happens and then I'll, go do my thing. So sometimes I get like an eerie feeling like that, but
yeah,
just me kind of like,
yeah. It's more your brain telling you a story than what's really actually happening out there. So yeah, maybe break it into kind of two resource issues here. For Florida Trail people who are just coming to hike on the Florida Trail for, their 2-month stint, and then a separate kind of resource for people who may be living in Florida who want to get to know Florida it better and what they could encounter, like what kind of resources would people find valuable?
Let's see.
And I will put most of this stuff up on the show notes. So if you're talking about anything, I will put on the show notes.
Absolutely. I think the most helpful or like fun resource that I own that's great to look at is the Florida Natural Heritage book that I gave you. So listen to the show notes. Because that is like a good snapshot. It was done by the Florida Natural Areas Inventory. Keith Curry-Pucci talked about on his podcast.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it's great because it has wonderful photos. It talks about habitat. It talks about like some of the best like memorable landscapes of Florida that you should go visit. So it's like a quick and like visual way to be like, oh, this seems cool. I should try to explore this, close to or off the trail. So I think that's like a fun resource for people to see. And obviously it talks about flora and fauna and like habitat in general, but it does it in a very interesting way. And then if you live here and really want to learn more, I mean, there's different levels of books. There's the Florida Natural Ecosystems and Native Species. There's volumes 1, 2, and 3 that talk about, freshwater, water, wetlands, and uplands of Florida, the different volumes. And that's like more information than what that other atlas, the Florida Natural Heritage book, will give you. Then you have the Florida Ecosystem book, which is like a maroon book with a yellow cover or yellow sun on the cover. And that's more like a traditional textbook with lots of information. Yeah. But that I feel like is great because I use that as like a reference book. So like I'm going out to Kissimmee Prairie, I'm going to look up Florida Dry Prairie, and then it tells me like within the Florida Dry Prairie system, there's actually all these other little types of ecosystems that you can look up, and then specifically calls out like vegetation for that ecosystem or fauna for that ecosystem. So it gets like more specific, so the parts that you're interested in about a specific type of ecosystem, you can like find out. And it's organized in a very thoughtful way, and that makes sense, I feel like. And also gives you like history and that kind of stuff too, which I feel like is a fun resource. And then, I mean, one fun book that I really, really enjoy, and like when I don't have any plans for an upcoming weekend and I want to figure something out, I go to Sandra's book with the Botanical Wonders of Florida. I think that's what it's called. Exploring Florida's Botanical Wonders, excuse me. And that's great because she explicitly says like, you should go here because it has a great habitat, or you should go here because there's this really cool tree you need to see, or, so that's always fun. So if you're more botanically minded and that's what interests you, that's a good reference. And I think all of Florida is encompassed in that, and it's like short little description. So it's not only like parks and natural places, there's also like botanical gardens and like other things that are of interest that are included in that as well.
Okay. Yeah. So that sounds like great resources. Now, what about the Florida Native Plant Society? I know you're involved with them somewhat, like if somebody really wanted to take this to the next level, like what do you guys do there?
Yeah. So the Florida Native Plant Society, their mission is to preserve, conserve, and, protect and promote native plants, whether they're occurring naturally in the wild and should be protected, or people in their own cultivated landscapes planting native plants. So that's what they're advocating for. There's the state organization, and then there's local chapters throughout. Miami-Dade, Broward, Palm Beach are very active chapters, and I think Martin County as well. They hold monthly meetings. They also have typically monthly field trips. So that's always fun to get involved if you really do want to learn more about plants. For the chapter I'm a part of Broward, we have all different kind of speakers that come. So the meetings, it's really a speaker giving a presentation. So like one, for example, Jimmy Lang from Fairchild Botanical Garden, who's a field botanist there, came and spoke to us and specifically talked about biodiversity in Florida. And he talked about, those influences of the Caribbean and the coastal plain and why that's the way that it is. So a lot of that information I learned from him, from his talk. We also had somebody come and talk about butterflies who's involved with NABA, which is the North American Butterfly Association. So they kind of like bring in people that, it's not always specifically about native plants, but it always relates back to native plants. So that's just fun. I mean, you can obviously go on the Florida Native Plant website. A lot of the chapters have their own websites and social media just to like learn more information that way. But yeah, it's a great organization, and like everyone that I've met through Florida Native Plant Society is nice. Like they care about the world. They care about people, they care about plants, they care about wildlife. So it's just a fun like group to like be a part of, which I enjoy.
Yes. Now, when someday this pandemic tapers off, what's on your goal list to go hike?
So I'm so excited. So in the fall, I have a big trip planned to the Panhandle. I'm going camping with my parents. We're going to St. George's Island State Park. So I will be near Apalachicola National Forest and near St. Mark. So we're staying there for a couple of days. So I'm hoping I can do day trips in to either possibly hike sections of the Florida Trail there. I'm really excited about that. And then part of that leg of that trip, we're also going to Blackwater River State Park. Yes. So I'm excited for that too. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that trip still happens. Also, I mean, we planned it for September. Fingers crossed that weather and storms cooperate, and that's like the big, like looking forward to. But obviously, I really want to get back to my Malabar Scrub Sanctuary once this is all over, because that's been closed. So I haven't been able to go there, and all the milkweeds are blooming right now. Like I've seen Asclepias curtisii there, and Asclepias fei, which is the Florida milkweed, which is really pretty. So I know that's blooming. It's out there right now.
Now, have you been able to go anywhere locally and hike or do anything?
So I hiked in South Florida at Yamato Scrub Sanctuary, which is a natural area in Boca Raton here, right before they closed everything. So that was my last like hike. And then since then, the last time I did, the only thing I've done is this past weekend, I went up to Blue Cypress Lake in Indian River County and paddled there. So right now in Indian River County, their preserve or conservation areas, boat ramps, and majority of their parks are open. It's just like parks that are smaller with playgrounds and things like that are closed. So like they still have recreation areas open, which is nice, you know, because when we went out there at Blue Cypress, there's some people there, but we were all hundreds of yards away from each other. So it was nice to be able to get a little bit of nature. So we went and paddled, which we stayed apart on our kayaks. So
that's a nice kind of rural county. So I can see that they would leave things open because it wouldn't be nearly as swamped as, you know, down in Palm Beach County.
I mean, Blue Cypress is way out in the west part of the county, close to the trail. So it's pretty out there in the middle of nowhere. But it was nice because I had, for someone who always is out in nature and then to suddenly not, it's been a bit of a struggle for me. It's just different, you know, lifestyle now, working from home and, you know, working remotely. So that's different. And then, you know, working in a job that is, you know, solid full day's worth of work, and then my weekends were always my escape. And like the hustle and bustle of South Florida, because I commute and all that, so on a daily basis. And then on the weekends, I'm always like, okay, time to go out and do something and explore and take time for myself. So that's kind of been changed in a different way. Mm-hmm. So it's been more like when I am home and I am not doing things on the week, like the other weekend, and like reading books and planning for another time or learning, you know, so just taking the time to do something else.
Yeah.
Back out there soon.
I completely feel you. We got out last weekend for a few hours and we wanted to go this weekend, but we ended up having rainstorms. It was pretty much rained all weekend. So we didn't go anywhere, and think this weekend might be good. And Texas state parks are reopening, but you have to make a reservation and you have to wear a mask in the state park, and I have reservations about that. And some, like, is hiking away from people, like, I don't want to wear a mask. I feel like, is that necessary? Yeah, sure. Maybe at the grocery store, maybe if I'm at the park office, that sort of situation is called for. But I don't know. I'm kind of curious. I'm kind of waiting to see like how that really plays out. But otherwise, we have a couple national forests we can go to. So.
Absolutely. I mean, it's kind of amazing because where I live, there's like a lake and people are out walking and doing all that kind of stuff. And, you know, a lot more people are out and needing to be in nature, and then not having access to those places is tough, you know, especially for those people that crave it and need it balanced and be in the right kind of state of mind. So, I mean, I get it. It's kind of like blanket rules to keep everyone safe.
Of course.
I'm thinking like Hungry Land Natural Area, Palm Beach, that's in the middle of nowhere, or like Kissimmee Prairie out in the middle where you're really like away from civilization to a degree. I was like, I wish Kissimmee Prairie was open. I had to make a spring trip, and for that I took off time from work to go for the spring wildflower walk, and that obviously didn't happen. But yeah.
Well, I guess maybe to wrap up, where can people follow you? And I know you've had a couple photos published, I think. Where can, people find all of that good stuff and find out more information and learn from you?
Yes. So I mainly share through Instagram. That's the best way to keep tabs on what I'm up to. You can follow me at Steph Lee. It's STEFFLEIGH. I share photos on my feed. And then in the past year and a half, 2 years, I've gotten into Insta story. So oftentimes when I do go hiking, I obviously have my camera. I take lots of photos. So basically like chronologically, like how I hike or paddle, that's how I'll post in my story. So like I'll try to post like I'm at Malabar Scrub Sanctuary, and then I start to go into what you're seeing, and then I'll add plant IDs or animal, IDs to that. So that's been a new way. A lot of people have reached out and they get really excited when I share that kind of content. It takes a while to do because I'm also editing kind of the photos too before I upload, do some slight tweaks and stuff. And then I've also been saving them to highlights. So I cleared all my highlights last year. So if you actually go to my Instagram feed now and go all the way back, you can actually see all the nature adventures I've actually done this year. So it kind of also creates like a little bit of like an album where I can kind of like comb back through and see everything. So Instagram obviously is the best place to connect with me and see what I'm up to. I'm trying to figure out if I should do something with my photos. That's a constant struggle. I'm like a photo hoarder. I just like take so many on my camera, and I have so much of like a backlog. I'm trying to figure out what I can do with them. I've kind of like toyed with the idea of maybe doing some sort of blog. I don't know, a website or something. I just don't know how to organize my photos because I do go back to places again and again. Like it would be neat to organize them in a way that's like timeline wise, like anytime you want to go to Jonathan Dickinson in spring, like you can go and see the photos and compare from year to year. Like then it almost becomes like citizen scientist because I'm taking so many photos. You're kind of like documenting the species and like when they're blooming and that kind of stuff. And that makes a whole another layer of like information. So I don't know what I'm going to do with them, but yeah, I've had the one big photo published was the one on the newsletter for Conservation Florida. I took a picture of the pine lily out at the BioBlitz event that I attended at Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park. So that was fun. Mom and Dad liked that. And Mom's like, you got to do something with your photos. They're cool. And I was like, I don't know what to do with them. And like one or two here and there. I think Florida Native Plant Society put one of my pictures on the cover of like an annual report for like their board members or stuff. So not a lot, just a little bit. And then Conservation Florida, or Florida Conservation Voters, excuse me, have asked me to like share some of my photos and videos with them to use for content. So they're super nice. Carson Mitchell, I believe is her name, is over there. She's doing all their social media stuff, and she's really sweet. And she like reached out to me. I was like, okay, I'm not getting paid for any of this stuff. I'm just doing it because I want people to see, Florida. So maybe one day, but for now, Instagram.
Oh, I enjoy it. I always go to your stories. I'm like, ooh, and I hope I don't annoy you. So I was like, I just want to like starry eye, all of them, like, or the heart eye one. Like, ooh, I like that.
That's so sweet. And then I guess the other thing I would say too, if you're interested in the landscape architecture and kind of like what I do on like my professional side of my career, you can always visit Cadence Living on Instagram, CADENCELIVING, or cadence-living.com. Through my job, actually, we've done a few hikes. So we've promoted it through that. I've led that at Jonathan Dickinson. We also did one at Everglades at Long Pine Key for National Hike Day. So we do stuff through that. So you can always attend an event that we promote through my job too, if you want to meet and go on a hike. So okay. Another way.
Well, thanks for so much for coming on the podcast and talking about, everything you do. I'm always inspired by your photos. And I think like if you're interested in coming onto the Florida Trail and you don't know anything about it,
and you don't know anything about Florida and the landscape itself, your Instagram is definitely an account to follow, because you get a good look of what's, especially in South Florida, like the landscape, the plants, animals. You get a good feel of it. And I feel like some people come to Florida with like maybe a negative mindset, and if they just knew a little bit about Florida and its habitats, they would change their mind just a little bit. So
absolutely, I hope so. And thank you so much for the kind words, and definitely get out there and explore.
That's it for my chat with Stephanie. You can find the show notes for the episode at orangeblaze.thegardenpathpodcast.com. The podcast can be found on Instagram as Orange Blaze Podcast and on Facebook as Official Orange Blaze Podcast. Happy hiking,